What a joy it was to gather at Ardgour Parish Church on Sunday the 29th of August, a fifth Sunday of the month, for a joint service with friends from Strontian and Morvern parishes as well, and indeed some from Acharacal and Kilhoan and further afield. Guest preacher was Lord Wallace, the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. And following is the sermon that he delivered on that occasion. And after worship, we were able to enjoy tea, coffee and snacks outside in the Millennium Garden on a beautiful sunny August afternoon.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. To the minister, elders and congregations of Ardgour and Kingairloch, Strontian and Morven, and indeed others from parts of the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, may I bring you the warm greetings of the General Assembly. Rosie and I are very pleased to be here today sharing in worship with you, and especially to be with your Minister Donald. As convener of the General Assembly Business Committee, Donald has been a source of encouragement and guidance to me since I was nominated as Moderator Designate. And I was particularly grateful for his level head and support as we navigated the digital online General Assembly in May. I perhaps should also add that Donald and Rosie were brought up in the same church in Milngavie, Cairns Church, Milngavie. Now, there is an age difference, and Rosie had moved on when Donald performed in the very renowned Cairns Church pantomimes. I'm quite amazed to think that this time last year, I was preparing for my interview with the committee for nominating the moderator. When I'd been deliberating and praying as to whether to agree to my name being submitted for nomination, one of the concerns which played on my mind was that in spite of much experience of public speaking, standing up to deliver a sermon is something quite different. Moreover, as I said to those who were encouraging me, I don't have any theological training, to which the retort was unanimously, count that as a plus. What I do have is legal training. But on reading today's lectionary passage from Mark's Gospel, I'm immediately reminded that on a number of occasions, Jesus condemned lawyers along with Pharisees. We had that in the first verse, and then in Matthew chapter 23, we read, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." Now, this is neither the time nor the place to attempt a rehabilitation of the legal profession. Suffice to say that Jesus recognized that law can and should embrace noble things like justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And as well as trying to secure fairness in a well-ordered society, many lawyers act to defend the vulnerable, the weak, and the oppressed. Now, the problem with these lawyers and the Pharisees was their hypocrisy. Now, at first hearing, you might think, well, the Pharisees maybe had a point in reproaching the disciples for not washing their hands before a meal. We talked about directions and signs. Often over the last 18 months have we been exhorted to wash our hands thoroughly, even to the extent of doing so while saying happy birthday through twice. But Jesus sees through their remonstrations. He quotes from the prophet Isaiah, and he says that they honour God with their words, but their heart is really far away from him. Laws are interpreted for their own benefit, and in doing so, they reject the real law of God. Legalism squeezes out love. Now, my practice of the law and subsequently politics brought home to me the limitations of both. Neither is inherently wrong or malign. One of my motivations was to try and do things which could improve people's lot and enable them to enjoy life in greater abundance. Indeed, countless laws have been enacted to defend the weak or promote social justice and well-being. But I readily recognized that laws don't necessarily change hearts. But God's love, as witnessed through the life and teaching of Jesus, can and does change hearts. As Dr. Martin Luther King expressed it more eloquently, morality cannot be legislated for, but behaviour can be regulated. Judicial decrees may not change the heart, but they can restrain the heartless. And the distinction between the laws of men and women and the way of Jesus can be illustrated by two very different answers to much the same question. On the last Sunday in August in 1928, May Donoghue met a friend in a Paisley cafe. When her friend poured the remaining contents of a bottle of ginger beer into her glass, the decomposed body of a snail also tumbled out. Now, Miss Donoghue claimed that she suffered gastroenteritis as well as shock, so she sued the manufacturer, Mr. Stevenson. The legal case made its way up to the top appeal court in the House of Lords. And the issue was what duty of care, if any, was owed by Mr. Stevenson to Miss Donoghue, whom he had never met. Was she his neighbour? In what was arguably one of the most significant legal judgments of the 20th century, very distinguished judge Lord Atkins said this: "Who then in law is my neighbour? The answer seems to be persons who are so closely and directly affected by my act that I ought reasonably to have them in contemplation as being so affected that I am directing my mind to the acts or omissions which are called into question." So there you have it. But 1900 years earlier, a young lawyer asked Jesus much the same question: who is my neighbour? And the answer was the parable of the Good Samaritan. The difference is quite stark and profound. It's not to belittle Lord Atkins' landmark judgment. That development of the law has ensured just redress probably for millions over the last 90 years. But it illustrates the limits of legal justice, whilst the parable of the Good Samaritan reveals to us the boundless loving depth of God's justice. Psalm 15, which we've heard read, echoes a similar message. Lord, who may enter your temple? Who may dwell on your holy hill? Some scholars have suggested that this was based on the procedures that were performed at the gate of the temple, where gatekeepers ensured that the qualifications for entry were met, no doubt involving rituals associated with purity and fulfilling the requirements for sacrificial offerings. But the ensuing verses of this short psalm point away from the religious observance of legalistic demands, but rather focus on walking blamelessly, doing what is right, and speaking the truth from the heart. It is what comes from the heart which matters. And if that was important in preparation for entering God's holy presence in the temple, it surely matters in our everyday life as we encounter God's holy presence in his creation and in the lives of our neighbours who bear God's image. And the psalmist is quite specific about some of the ways in which we should treat or not treat our neighbours. In today's social media world, I'm particularly struck by the requirement in that psalm not to slander with the tongue nor take up a reproach against a neighbour. For I sometimes fear that ever more abusive and bullying language used in social media platforms is at risk of being normalised. What is said in such messages can and does impact on individuals, sometimes even to the detriment of their mental health. And although written centuries before the arrival of Twitter, as an expectation as to what God requires of us, these words surely have a current relevance. We may not realistically expect the peddlers of such abuse to be familiar with what the psalmist says is required of us, but should we not, as Christians, be calling out such abuse? The psalm also commends making loans without charging interest. In those days, loans were most likely sought by the most vulnerable. So by implication, those who would exploit that vulnerability are condemned. Then in verses 22 and 23 of the chapter 7 of Mark's Gospel, where Jesus is emphasizing that what it comes from the heart that makes a person unclean, the wrongs he lists can be said to have something in common. They're almost all perpetrated against someone else, and often someone less powerful. And how that contrasts with those things which can come from the heart and which can reveal a love for your neighbour. But as we reflect on this passage in Mark's Gospel, can I suggest something to you which is totally counterintuitive? That just for a moment, we put ourselves into the shoes of the Pharisees. Now, such is the condemnation of the Pharisees throughout the Gospels, I accept it's a difficult thing to do. Many of them undoubtedly reeked of hypocrisy. Latterly, they were trying to trip Jesus up to find a pretext to condemn him. But as one commentator on this passage observed, many Pharisees had a deep-rooted faith and belief that the law was God-given. And in the words of the book of Exodus, marked Israel out as a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. It was what distinguished them from and made them an example to other nations. The Pharisees took seriously their duty to safeguard the law, and not least at a time of Roman occupation. So actions which apparently undermined the law certainly rattled them, and in their view needed to be called out. But Jesus' very direct condemnation of them is not so much because they wanted the law observed, but because such a chasm has grown up between what they preached and what was in their hearts. So rigid was their pursuit of what they saw as faithfulness that they had lost sight of what really matters. And they had created division between themselves and anyone who was not as punctilious in religious observation as they were. Such people were other. So why do I suggest that, albeit briefly, we put our feet in the shoes of the Pharisees? Maybe we should take a step back and take a look at ourselves. Pause and consider whether in our very sincere efforts to be faithful, we look askance at those who do things differently. That ours must be the right way because it's I been. And let us ponder who, through our much loved religious practices and observances, quite unwittingly, we have excluded. I become aware during lockdown, people who previously showed little interest in institutional church life have been logging on to online worship. People who before COVID may not even have known their neighbours had been undertaking many acts of kindness for their neighbours. Practical responses to the command to love your neighbour, possibly without ever realising it. I just recently finished reading a book by an American pastor, Alan J. Roxburgh, with the exceptionally long, challenging and somewhat ambitious title, Joining God, Remaking Church and Changing the World. Roxburgh claims, we don't live in a world of unbelief. People are yearning to believe in something, but churches can't capture their attention. But he's far from downbeat. He believes that the Spirit is disrupting and calling our churches into a new imagination about what it means to follow the way of Jesus. It does not mean that we disown tradition. The American theologian Jaroslav Pelikan said, tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And it is traditionalism that gives tradition a bad name. Our challenge, I believe, and our opportunity must be to try and embrace today's spiritual longings. Not by turning the clock back or expecting people to come flocking through the church doors now they're open again, but to celebrate the living faith that has been handed down to us, to proclaim God's kingdom of justice and love, to be open to new imaginations, and to follow where the Spirit leads us. Amen.